There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and if I've counted right, my 7th annual Besties and Worsties. This one for the reading year 2023 that was. Well, that I debut a fresh new blouse for my Besties and Worsties, and look at this one. Oh, I love it so much. So, yes, the award for best blouse goes to this one. I would say overall I've had a really great reading year. I've got so much to tell you that I'm going to have to be uncharacteristically brief, so that's enough of a preamble. Let's get to the awards. The first award, as in years past, is the best opening line or paragraph, and this one I have a tie. It definitely is a tie, but one of the other reasons that I wanted it to be a tie is that it will give me a chance to talk about one book in particular that probably was number 6, didn't make my top 5 reads, but was this close, so I get to talk about it. It's not this one. This one was a great novel, but it certainly had an incredible opening passage, which I'm going to read to you. The Scottish novel Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan. Many things I loved about this. It came out in 2020, so you don't need to know anything, and there's nothing spoilery about this opening, but listen to this. This is just lovely. Tully Dawson made himself new to the world and ripe for the glories of that summer by showing he was unlike his father. It wasn't a matter to fight over. Some families are made up of strangers and nothing can change it. But I think it always bothered Tully that Woodbine couldn't cheer him on when he came by the football field to watch the game. The old man would only shake his head in a know-all way and stare at the Firth of Clyde with an injured look. Tully had named him after the cigarettes. They all had their nicknames, those reluctant fathers. They sat at home opening cans of lager and cursing our Saturday nights. I suppose we could have drifted over to the touchline and asked his opinion, but being young is a kind of warfare in which the great enemy is experience. Our cheeks burned, and we watched him walk towards the unstained light of the harbor. And the tie best opening to a novel is Marzahn Mon Amour by Katja Oskamp, translated from the German by Joe Heinrich. I had Joe Heinrich on as a mystery guest a few weeks ago. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. It'll be right under the information about the book. And this is the one. It's probably my 6th favorite read this year. It just floored me. I loved it so much. It's kind of autofiction. It's about a writer who, in middle age, like in her 40s or something, she retires from writing. She gives up writing because she's had some rejections and she hadn't had much success. And she becomes a pedicurist, giving pedicures to elderly Germans in East Berlin. And each chapter is a story of one of her clients, and it's just gorgeous, beautiful, moving. Here is the opening, which sets it all up very beautifully. The middle years, when you're neither young nor old, are fuzzy years. You can no longer see the shores you started from, but you can't yet get a clear enough view of the shore you're heading for. You spend these years thrashing about in the middle of a big lake, out of breath, flagging from the tedium of swimming. You pause at a loss and turn around in circles again and again. Fear sets in, the fear of sinking halfway, without a sound, without a cause. I was 44 years old when I reached the middle of the big lake. My life had grown stale, my offspring had flown the nest, my other half was ill, and my writing, which had kept me busy until then, was more than a little iffy. I was carrying something bitter within me, completing the invisibility that befalls women over 40. I didn't want to be seen, but nor did I want to see. I'd had it with people, the looks on their faces, and their well-meant advice. I sank to the bottom. It's just pitch perfect, because then she goes on a journey with her clients that come in once a month or however often they come in, where she sees incredibly deeply into the looks on people's faces and the stories embedded in their damaged, worn feet. Just an incredible book. Next is the sexiest writing or scene, and this is also a tie, and I'm not going to read anything to you, both because I don't have any time, but it would kind of be a spoiler in both cases. I should say, it's a bit of a misnomer to call it the sexiest writing. Most people, when they think of sexy, they think of graphic sex or erotic, and I tend to go for beautiful writing about sex that links it up with other things. That's my sweet spot. So maybe I should rename the category, but it's a what's the word I'm looking for? Clickbait. The first one comes from this wonderful British novel, The Stromness Dinner by Peter Benson. I read early this year. It was published in 2020. And the protagonist, who is adorable, more on him later, young straight guy Ed Beach. He's a foodie, and he's a general contractor, kind of renovation guy with his dad. You wouldn't think he would be a protagonist that I would fall in love with. Well, there's the idea of his oh no, I'll stop talking about him. We're going to talk about him later, but he gets into a relationship near the end of this novel. And he describes, and I'm not going to say very much about it, because even if I tell you the metaphor that he uses, it's just going to spoil it for you when you read it, because you must read this novel. But he uses a particular metaphor in lieu of describing what his first night together in bed with his beloved is like. He uses an extended metaphor instead, and it's one of the most powerful and, yes, I will say it, erotic pieces of writing I've read this year. And that ties with a scene in this 2023 novel by Ellen Hawley, A Decent World. At the opening of the novel, the protagonist's 90-something grandmother, an avowed communist to the end, who dies in the era of the Occupy Wall Street, but had been a lifelong communist. Her granddaughter who had been raised by her and lived with her right until the end, is grief-stricken, and she goes over to, and I won't get into any complicating details, but she goes over to her girlfriend's house. It needs comforting, and that turns sexual, and it was one of the most incredible. I mean, there's nothing graphic about it. Again, those aren't the ones that get Shawn the Book Maniac's attention. There is just something so profound about the way grief brings people together sexually. And it's something, gay men can relate to that, having of a certain age, living through the AIDS epidemic. So just powerful, beautiful. And I'm not going to read it to you, even though it wouldn't be a spoiler too, because I have a chat with Ellen Hawley in my pipeline. It'll be coming this month in January, where she reads that section. So stay tuned for that. The next award is for Best Cover, and hands down, that goes to the cover of Sharon Butella's, I don't know what's her 20th novel or her 17th novel, but I think it was her 22nd book, Leaving Wisdom. A great novel. I interviewed her. My first interview with her earlier this year was about this novel. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. There's many great things about the novel. You're going to be hearing more about Sharon Butella later in this broadcast, but look at that cover. About a woman born and raised on a farm outside a small town in Saskatchewan, who returns decades and decades later to live in the small town where she grew up. And I just think that picture is so perfect for this novel. And in fact, that picture resonates with me so deeply that I would like it hanging on my wall. Let's see, can I find out who the artist is? The cover and book design is by Tanya Cran, but it sounds like the image comes from a photo or art stock service called Stocksy and Unsplash, but I just fall into that cover image. Next is the book I wish I had bailed on. In other words, a book that I did finish, but in retrospect wish I hadn't bothered to. Because I bail on so many books, there's really only one or two obvious choices, and I've given it to the African novel Kibogo by Scholastic Mukasonga, translated by Mark Polizzotti, translated from the French. I have read Scholastic Mukasonga's incredible novel, autofictional novel called Cockroach, or maybe Cockroaches, which just obliterated me. But I found this, her latest offering in English, really unsatisfying. It's about various characters in Rwanda at a time where the old African spirituality is being displaced by colonial Christian missionary BS. And intellectually, it was interesting, but I felt that the novel failed utterly to bring the characters to life, and they were just mouthpieces through which various historical or social political ideas were being expressed, and I just really didn't like it and wish I hadn't bothered wasting my time. I buddy read this with Heidi in my reading life, and we agreed on it 100%, but I've heard other people quite liked it, so it takes all kinds to make a world. Next is my favorite character, and hands down, that is the protagonist, Ed Beach, from the Stromness Dinner. So I already warned you I was going to be talking about him again. I think he's in his late 20s. Straight guy, works with his dad on home renovation, and he's a foodie. He's not particularly articulate, and it's a first-person voice on the page. And his personality, he is so adorable in a way that just captured my heart. That just think about him all the time. Part of it is he made himself, like, there was something about him that was very straight, but not macho. Like, there was a softer side that I loved, but also, you know, he was a big strapping young man and liked sex, and how Peter Benson portrayed his character in a way that where I didn't think, I'm not a woman, I like to call myself a feminist, but where I didn't think there was a whiff of misogyny or sexism or anything, but just he just made it a bottomlessly lovely impression on me. Next is my award for the best conclusion, and that is for my top read of the year, Collected Works by Lydia Sandgren, translated from the Swedish by Agnes Brume. It is my top read of the year. I called it when I read it in July or something, so you're going to be hearing more about it later. But I thought about the conclusions of all the other novels I loved this year, and I thought, no, nothing compares to the way this novel concluded. Of course, I'm not going to tell you about it, because that would be a spoiler, just to say that it's deeply, satisfyingly open-ended. And the best way that I can convey the impact is to tell you that my buddy reader, Jo Smith, when she finished this book, she hugged the book. So that's how powerful the ending was for Jo and I. Next is my award for the best sentence. Most of you know that I do Sunday sentences where I put up, I didn't invent the thing, somebody else invented it, but where you on Bookish social media, you put up your favorite sentence that you read that week. And so I'm always doing that, and I like to gussy them out with the pictures that I spend quite a bit of time finding the perfect picture available online to match the quote and so on. And I've had some doozies this year, but this one takes the cake, or should I say takes the prize. And it is from this wonderful, very challenging novel, After Sappho by Selby Wynne Schwartz, which I loved, and I don't need to set it up at all. This is a true story, like all the other lesbian lives narrated in After Sappho. This is based on fact, and I don't think she played around with the facts at all. I certainly haven't heard that. So listen to this. Anna Kulishkov had sung for her supper in the parks of northeastern Ukraine. She had survived tuberculosis and childbirth and exile. The only thing she feared was compromise, the soothing voice that licks down rage until it is nothing but a small, smooth lump in your hand. The next award is for the best short story, and I read a whole bunch of short stories, and I couldn't choose between these two, so I decided I didn't have to. So another tie, and the first one is by a Bengali writer who just is absolutely fascinating to me. Based on reading this book, I have to say that this short story collection by Mahasweta Devi, called Breast Stories, translated by Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, I only really liked the story I'm giving the award to. The other two didn't work for me, but I'm eager to read more of Devi's writings, and there's volumes and volumes that have been translated. She was a firebrand political activist. She was born in the Brahmin class, the upper class, and she fought for the social political rights of lower classes her whole life, and wrote a lot of books. Based on this one story called Droppity, I am obsessed with her. The other two didn't measure up, but I've got much more to discover. Jo Smith has put me on to Devi, and we're going to be buddy reading, I think, a novel in 2024. The story Droppity is about a freedom fighter. I believe she belonged to the Maoist rebels. My memory being what it is, not great. I don't remember all of the social political details, but she's basically a Maoist rebel hiding out in the jungle in that part of India. The government, the secret police or whatever they are, they're after her. So the first half of the story is about ridiculous, imbecilic secret police and their quest to find her. They've already killed her husband, and now they're looking for her. And then we switch in the second half of the story to her, and her indefatigable courage is just incredible to read. One of the kinds of fiction that I respond to deeply is fiction that has some kind of a social political undergirding context, where the context doesn't overwhelm the story, and where I feel like by falling so deeply into the story and getting to know the characters as deeply as well-wrought fiction can enable, that I'm getting a heavy dose of social political instruction in the only way that it ever really works for me. And there's a lot of fiction, and I would say the other two stories in this collection, by my judgment, fail because the social political stuff kind of overwhelms the story. But in this one, it was just pitch perfect, droppity. One of the two best stories I've read this year. The other one that I absolutely loved has no social political message whatsoever. It is called Swim Team, and it's in this collection by Miranda July. No One Belongs Here More Than You, and it is about a kind of socially isolated young woman. She's recalling having lived in a small town for no reason that makes sense in the story, but she's just kind of living there in a small community, and she's isolated, and she overhears a conversation at the local grocery store among some old timers, some elderly people talking about swimming or not, being afraid to swim or not having ever learned to swim. And she speaks up and says, "I'll teach you." And she gives them swimming lessons in her bachelor or one-bedroom apartment. You absolutely must read this story. It is one of the very best stories I've ever read. I talked about it and discussed it on an episode of the Bookcast Club podcast earlier this year, and we had a rousing discussion. The two lovely people I was discussing it with were as blown away by the story as I was. So that also was just a standout piece of short fiction this year. The next award is for a book that has stayed with me and is aging well. Typically, I choose a book that I wasn't sure about at the time that I finished it, or that I didn't particularly like, that has grown on me. This book is not like that. I loved the book when I finished it, but I love it even more. So it's a little bit different than my choices in years past. And that is the Canadian novel, The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayer, a prize-winning book. I don't mention that prize in polite company anymore. And I have a full review, which I'll link in the show notes. Suzette Mayer came to Word on the Street, a literary festival in Saskatoon in the summer, so I got my copy signed. What I love about this book is it's the most Canadian novel that I've ever read. In other words, it incorporates so many themes. Like, Canada's a boring place in so many ways, and this book is about the interesting parts of Canada, race and sexuality, on the National Railway going across the country. It's all here. I have a rather impassioned review that I'll link to in the show notes, and yeah, this one I just love more and more the more time passes and the more I think about it. The next is my award for the most vivid setting, and I had to think about this for a while, and I'm giving it to Grey Bees by the Ukrainian writer Andrei Kirkov. This was translated from the Russian by Boris Draliuk, and setting is so important in this novel. The protagonist is living in the gray zone, and this goes back to stage one of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, going back a decade or more, where he started to encroach on one of the borders between Russia and Ukraine. And our protagonist, Sergei, he's living in the gray zone where it's not Ukraine, it's not Russia, and why he's staying there, God only knows. But there's only one other guy in the town who is his childhood frenemy. Otherwise, the village is abandoned, and the description of that village and all the ways in which nationalisms and war shape and disfigure that village was an incredible part of the story. And all of the other parts, because he does go on a bit of a journey in the novel, are equally vivid. There's many other things I absolutely loved about this novel, but one of the things that I loved the most was the vividness of the setting. Veterans of my Besties and Worsties will notice, starting last year, maybe even the year before, that I don't have as many negative bitchy categories as I used to. I used to have an award for the puke-worthiest paragraph and the on-sexiest scene. But, I mean, I'm choosing what I read more wisely, or I'm bailing before I get to any candidates for those particular awards. So there's very little of the negative. I'm sorry, but I'm getting older and not wiser, softer, or more prone to accentuate the positive. One of the ones that has survived is The Most Surprising Bail. And that, hands down, goes to the novel Indians on Vacation by Thomas King, because I love Thomas King. I hadn't read maybe other than a short story or two. I hadn't read any of his fiction, but his The Inconvenient Indian was a transformative read for me. Work of nonfiction about indigenous politics and social and political issues. And this is his latest novel that isn't a mystery. Came out 2 or 3 years ago. And it started out really good, but I found the main character, who reminded me a lot of the authorial voice in The Inconvenient Indian, and the banter between the protagonist here, I believe his name is Bird, and his wife in this novel reminded me a lot about the little bit of that kind of banter between Thomas King and his wife in Inconvenient Indian. However, it was just too much. I was overwhelmed by it. I started hating the protagonist, and it just was a dog's breakfast of plot that didn't make any sense. And so about halfway through, or maybe even a little more than halfway through, I shocked the hell out of myself by just putting it down. I have not given up on Thomas King. I will try other of his novels, especially earlier stuff. This one just didn't work for me, and I was surprised. The next one is The Most Moving Passage or Scene, and I'm not going to read anything to you because it would be pretty spoilery, but it definitely comes from the American writer William Maxwell's They Came Like Swallows. This novel just broke my heart. It's set at the end of World War I in America. I don't remember where in America. I think it's, I don't remember. I'm terrible for not remembering or paying attention to setting. Illinois, maybe. Chicago or something. And we get various points of view of a family that consists of 2 brothers, a mother and a dad. And it's at the beginning of the flu epidemic, and that's all I'm going to say, because if I say any more, it's going to spoil it. But various scenes, especially at the end of the novel, just broke my heart. I read this to a patron. One of the benefits on my Patreon is that I will read a novel to you on Voxer or Facebook Messenger or something. And I broke down. I couldn't read the last chapter because I was so verklempt. It's one of the most beautiful books I read this year. Absolutely. I can't believe that I hadn't read anything by William Maxwell. I can't wait to read more by him. Oh, this is one of my favorite awards. I already gave you the best sentence, but I have a separate award for what I call the Goofiest, bestest quote. So one that's kind of tickles the funny bone. And surprise, surprise, it's from Barbara Pym. I reread Crampton Hodnet. It was actually another one of the books that I read to a patron. And that's one of my favorite Barbara Pym books. I don't know where my physical copy is, but here's the GIF. And you don't need any context to chortle at this one. Other than maybe to say that it's a 50 or 60-year-old bachelor that this sentence is about. He's not a young man. He's like 40, 50, or 60 or something like that. Of course, Mother was his whole life, and he would be quite lost without her. But he occasionally wondered if it might not be rather pleasant to be quite lost. Next is the award for the book I am most likely to reread the soonest, and hands down, that goes to my top read of the year, Collected Works by Lydia Sandgren, talked about it already, translated from the Swedish by Agnes Brume. And really, all I need to say about this is that it was such a rich narrative, such a dense, it didn't feel dense, but there was so many layers to it, and there were so many connections between the various parts of the story that it would really repay a second reading. That's all I need to say. I have a full review of this book. If I haven't mentioned that already, it'll be linked in the show notes. Collected Works. I think this is the second year running where I have had an award for the top 5 nonfiction reads. I'm not nearly as much of a nonfiction reader as I am a reader of fiction, but I certainly have 5 stellar works of nonfiction I want to tell you about. The last one will be my top nonfiction read of the year, so I'll save that for the last. The other 4 tie for second place. This is a collection of essays by my former prof, David Carpenter, called Writing Home Selected Essays. This essay collection is one of the best essay collections I've ever read, and I have a very subjective context through which I experienced these essays that may not translate to you or anybody else, but he was a prof of mine, and he was just a really bright light in the literary community in Saskatoon back in the 80s and 90s when I lived here, and I have done a couple interviews with him. My third interview with him will be about this essay collection. The second interview about another memoir will be going up on my channel later in January. But this spoke to me so deeply because it's about Western Canadian literature. There's a lot of autobiographical essays and a lot of writing about the conflicts and the challenges he experienced trying to marry a life of literary writing with academic life. And all of that spoke to me as a failed academic myself and to somebody who, I'm not a writer, but where I live kind of a writer adjacent life in a sense. I live amongst the literati. I live surrounded by books. These essays, almost all of them spoke so incredibly deeply to me that parts of it read like a spiritual autobiography. I absolutely loved it. I have loaned this book to my mum, so here's the cover gif. This is a biography of the Queen Mum, and am I a monarchist? I always stumble over this. I'm not much. I'm kind of a monarchist, but I just have my own personal mythology. I grew up as a wee child, fascinated by the royal family, and that just continues to this day. And I say that unapologetically. I don't spend a lot of time on my channel talking about that reading, but this biography of the Queen Mum just filled my heart with joy. It's called Do Let's Have Another Drink, The Dry Wit and Fizzy Life of Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother by Gareth Russell. Wonderfully written, a series of anecdotes or vignettes that really tied together to present a whimsical, but not just whimsical, you probably don't care enough to wait around for the words I'm grasping to finish that sentence, but it was a full-bodied treatment. I loved the Queen Mum, and this brought it all home for me. This is not a work of nonfiction, but I'll show this quickly. This is one of the favorite works of literature I've ever read. I've read it 3-4 times now. A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. And this year, with Heidi of My Reading Life, we buddy read a biography of J.L. Carr, The Last Englishman by Byron Rogers, and it is, without a doubt, the best literary biography I've ever read. It was really enigmatically structured and organized and beautifully written, and I learned so much about J.L. Carr to the point where I realized I wouldn't want to have a beer with him. He's dead, but I wouldn't have wanted to have a beer with him. But what a fascinating man he was, and it's deepened my interest in reading more of his fiction. But really, it's one of the most innovative, compelling literary biographies out there. If you care about J.L. Carr, and if you do, it's probably because of A Month in the Country. You must read this book. This was a library book that I read. I started it in 2022 and finished it early in 2023, called We Are Coming Home, Repatriation and the Restoration of Blackfoot Cultural Confidence, edited by Gerald Conati. I had not read much about this, but this is about repatriating indigenous artifacts and spiritual, in this case, it was largely bundles, spiritual bundles, which are sacred objects for the Blackfoot peoples that were not only in Alberta, but this centered on Blackfoot tribes in Alberta that got those spiritual bundles and other artifacts back from museums in Alberta. And this is an anthology of essays. The editor, Gerald Conati, he was the curator of the Glenbow Museum, if I'm remembering correctly. And many of the first-person essays about that experience of the evolution of museum thought, museum philosophy, the way that the Reconciliation era made this repatriation possible. It was just one of the most beautiful works of nonfiction I've read. in a long time. There was nothing particularly gorgeous about the writing, or certainly not consistently, but it just gave me a lot of hope and really opened my eyes to how colonialism in the arts and in the museum sphere is something that needs to be tackled more and more. It's a really impactful book. Without question, my top nonfiction read of the year was Sharon Butella's memoir from back in the, I'll look up the publication date in a minute, The Perfection of the Morning, An Apprenticeship in Nature. And I have a full interview with Sharon about this memoir, which I'll link to in the show notes. But this is a book that was, I think it's one of my mom's favorite books, and it's Sharon Butella's most well-known, most best-selling book. This one touched me so deeply. And as I explained to Sharon at the beginning of our chat, one of the reasons it did is because I grew up on a farm, but was obtuse, and I felt so out of place there that I just, with a few exceptions, I was just shut down and not aware of the beauty of the landscape, the land around me. And in my adult years, I've tried to compensate for that with reading a lot of farm fiction and so on. And this memoir about Sharon, she was not a city girl, but she had lived a lot of her adult life in the city. And she married a rancher in southern Saskatchewan and goes to spend decades with him on what at first, when she moved there in the, I forget, 80s maybe, was a really primitive, didn't have very much in the way of amenities or modern conveniences. And how she discovered in a visceral and spiritual way a sense of home and wonderment about the landscape in which she lived, and how it changed her and how it made her more herself. This memoir got all the way inside of me, and it's still vibrating in me. The best work of nonfiction I read this year. The next award goes to The Bale I Am Most Likely to Try Again. And this one was a bit of a shocker. It's a very well-received novel that was published earlier this year. The World and All That It Holds by Alexander Heman. A gay love story set amongst, now I can't remember if both of the protagonists were from the Balkans or not. Well, certainly one of them was, because he witnessed the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and the story goes from there. But despite the praise that other people have showered upon this one left me cold. I don't remember how far I got into it now, but maybe 100 pages, maybe more. And I just couldn't get invested in the characters. I didn't feel that the characters had jumped off the page. They barely sat up. Instead, the novel was preoccupied with various historical folktales, and I'm just not a big fan of folktales. I mean, this keeps falling out of its dress. They have their place, but it felt like the characters were given short shrift so that there was space for all these folktales, and that just didn't work for me. So I bailed, but given the almost unanimous high praise for it, I will try it again, but not for 5 or 10 years. The next is the most surprising 5-star read, and hands down, that goes to the collection of linked short stories, Thank You, Mr. Nixon by Gish Jen. I did it on audio, and because I ended up loving it, I bought the book, but I did it on audio only. And the first story I thought was awful, and the second story, the verbiage of it, the affected vocabulary of it, turned me off, and so I really seriously thought about bailing. And I think it was my dear friend Lindy, but it might have been other reasons why I kept going. And by the third story and the fourth story and the fifth story, I was hooked. I want to go back and read that first story to see if it hits me differently. I did realize that the affected diction of the second story fit the character of that story. So that's why I kept going. And this is a rich interlacing of Chinese characters and Chinese American characters and the interconnections between them. And it is a linked collection. So I'm not very observant about characters' names, and especially when I'm only doing a book on audio. So it took me quite a while, which is one of the reasons I want to read it again, to realize that there were some recurring characters. And once I started paying attention to that, the significance of the stories in relationship to each other just bowled me over. I had always had a bit of a negative attitude, and I have no special reason for having had it, for the Chinese American writer Gish Jen. But boy, on the basis of this, I need to read more by her. This was a really rich read. Next, the most disappointing read, and that goes to a indigenous novel by a writer who lives within the uncomfortable confines of Canada. Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. There was so much hype about this book. It was the publisher did a tremendous job of hyping it, and I got on the bandwagon, and I didn't like the Canadian cover. It was so ugly, so I got the American cover. Here it is, and got it delivered to me from the States shortly after publication date, and pretty much immediately started reading it. And I thought the first chapter or two, because it was billed as kind of a horror novel with literary pretensions, I read the first chapter or two and was quite impressed with the literary quality of it. And then it just went downhill. And by the end, I thought, Jesus Christ, every time I try a work of genre fiction, I'd always end up in this place. I didn't give this book a rating because I don't give negative ratings to books by marginalized writers, but it was a big disappointment. It just didn't sustain the literary quality that was established in the first couple chapters. But what can you expect from genre fiction? The next category, the next award has kind of done some shape-shifting over the years. I used to call it my favorite read published in whatever year it was. And I'm thinking, well, a lot of the books that are going to be in my top 5 are going to be published in 2023. So I've decided to give it to another book that maybe was number 7 on my top 5. So it's now kind of, maybe in another year I will call this my favorite debut novel that's not in my top 5, because this is a debut, but I'm calling it still my favorite read published this year, not on my top 5. I'm really excited about what this writer does in the future. And that is the queer Nigerian novel, And Then He Sang a Lullaby by, if I can remember the pronunciation, Annie Kayode Samtochukwu. And I read this with my friend Emeka in Nigeria. We did a pseudo buddy read, so the video of our discussion about it I will link below. I thought this was a really moving and important novel about queer men in Nigeria in the present day, and homophobia, internalized homophobia, with full-bodied characters that lived and breathed as I read the book, and it's a lot of heartbreaking stuff because of homophobia in the story that has, I was going to say, left a marvelous aftertaste. That's not quite the adjective I should use. It left quite a tragic aftertaste in a really satisfying way. A really impressive debut by a writer that I'm going to be following from here on in. The next category is rather curious, but I keep it on because I usually have one book that fits the bill, and that is the book I liked or loved that's faded away the most. In other words, a book that I quite enjoyed when I read it or loved, but that all these weeks or months later, I don't really remember very well. And I do have one that's a little bit surprising for that, and that is the Irish novel Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. This was a buddy read with Sonia of An Enthusiastic Reader. We both loved it. It's a much beloved book on BookTube and amongst many of my bookish buddies, including Ronan Hession in Dublin. And it's not that I don't remember what happened, but the emotional impact of this book is gone. So I can remember what happened, but I don't have the visceral feeling in my body that I did when I put the book down. And I don't know what that says about the book or says about me, but that is the one that receives this quote-unquote award for the book I loved that's faded away the most. We're getting down to the end here. The next award is for the best title. I'm giving that to this queer memoir, All Down Darkness Wide by Shawn Hewitt. Shawn Hewitt is I believe he's not actually Irish born, but he teaches in Dublin. I believe he was born in Britain, in England, but maybe I'm not remembering that correct. But this is a really quite powerful memoir about growing up gay, but in particular his first serious relationship. His lover was Swedish, After coming together and achieving such a deep intimacy and starting to build a life together, oh, all of my books keep slipping out of their dresses. His lover falls victim. I don't know if there's a better way to say it. Is overtaken by mental health challenges and things unravel with some gorgeous reflections on the closeted life of and the meaning of the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins that I will never forget. There was just so much to admire here, but one of the things to admire was that title, which I think comes from a Hopkins poem, All Down Darkness Wide. This is the part where I announce whether I have any New Year's resolutions in terms of my reading life, and I don't really. I was hobbled in my reading for much of the second half of the year because I allowed, with libertine licentiousness, my current reads to balloon up to, I think, a maximum of 44 books. It's gotten down fairly considerably by the end of the year. I'm not going to worry too much about that. I'm just going to let it take care of itself. It didn't prevent me from having a really great reading year, but it's ridiculous, and I'm probably not going to deal with it very much in 2024. The one resolution I have is that I'm not going to buy so many new releases. And I'm not going to say any more than that because the time is getting on. I'm talk about that in my most anticipated new releases video. So if you want to hear more about my thinking on that, you can watch there. The next award is for the worst book I read, and I didn't have anything other than a 2-star read. I usually have some 1-star reads, but I'm just getting better at bailing on them. So the 2-star read I have is Voting Day by Claire O'D, which I really disliked very much. The premise was brilliant. It's set during the time of a referendum in Switzerland, which is a true fact. The country of Switzerland in about 1950, I don't remember the year now, but had a referendum about whether women should be allowed the vote. And it failed. Women were not allowed the vote, and they didn't get the vote for another couple decades. Just obscenely ridiculous. And this narrative focuses on the lives of, I think, 3, but it could have been 4 women during that week that the referendum was on. I loved the first chapter, or the first section, which was about a farmer's wife who was traveling into the nearest city to have surgery. And she was overworked and harried, and she goes and stays with her daughter. And that first chapter or first section is in third person, and it just captured her character with so much dignity and precision that I thought, oh my God, this is going to be an amazing novel. But then the point of view switched in the second part to her daughter, and she was just like out of Legally Blonde or something. She was just a ditz, and I struggled for a long time. Is the author saying something about how misogynist societies construct ditzy women? I don't use the word ditz or ditzy in a gendered way. I have my own ditzy moments, but I just found her daughter so annoying, and I just felt she was stripped of the dignity that she deserved by the switch to a really, I would say, rather incompetent use of the first person, and it just went downhill from there. So I ended up being really disappointed. And finally, we're getting to the end. These are my top 5 works of fiction. I will save my number 1 pick for the end, but I'm not going to say too much about it since I've already mentioned it umpteen times. All the other books tie for second place. This wonderful novel about 2 trans women in Canada, Little Blue Encyclopedia for Vivian by Hazel Jane Plant. What an innovative, experimental work of fiction that had so much emotional power. Vivian is a straight trans woman. She's dead, quite young. Her best friend is also a trans woman, and I don't think she's ever named. She's the first person narrator of this story, and she is queer, so she is into women. Vivian was into men, and this is a expression of her grief for her friend Vivian in the form of an encyclopedia that the narrator creates for Vivian's favorite TV show. And I think it had 1 season, maybe 2 seasons. It doesn't exist in real life. As an encomium to Vivian, the narrator has created this encyclopedia of every character, every actor, every setting, any imaginable trivial detail about the series. she has created I was going to say an alphabetical encyclopedia, but that would be repeat it. Yeah, you don't need me to say alphabetical. The TV show was called Little Blue. Like I say, it doesn't exist in real life. And through that structure, manages to communicate so much emotionally powerful detail about her feelings for Vivian and the reality for trans people today. Oh, I just loved it with all my heart. Another one is The Stromness Dinner by Peter Benson. I think I've said enough about this already, but if I haven't, do check out my review, which will be linked in the show notes. The funny thing about this book is that I found the first reference I found to it made me think it was a queer story, a queer novel, and there's nothing about it that was queer other than my lustful adoration of the main character, but that's all. I don't think the author is queer, so it was a mistaken impression that led me to it. And I'm going to read the next novel by Peter Benson. He's written like 15 or 20 novels, but I'm going to read the next one he published after this. And if I love that one as much, I have a new favorite author. Oh, I love this. Next is Small Joys by the queer black novelist Alvin James Mensah, a debut novel that I read over about 5 months this year. I loved it so much. I haven't done a full review. I'm hoping to interview the author. I haven't got an answer from his publicist or whatever. I'm sure hoping I can get a chance to. But this was a novel about a young gay black guy in early 2000s. He drops out of college, moves home to rural England. He's got a Ghanaian British father who is so fundamentalist religious that they don't have much of a relationship, and he has ensconced in a circle of straight friends of various black and white men and women, and he has a lot of mental health challenges, including suicidal ideation. And the way that the story proceeds from there, if you like character-driven fiction, I would say the title is almost misnamed. The joys that I got out of reading this were large indeed. And the last one that ties for second place is this wonderful New Zealand novel, Loop Tracks by Sue Orr. I think it's only available outside New Zealand unless you're willing to pay a hefty shipping fee to buy it from New Zealand, which is what I did. It's available on ebook through Amazon or whatever. There's 2 timelines. The first one is 1978. Abortion has been, for a brief time, rendered illegal in New Zealand. So all the women that need abortions are going to Australia. And this 16-year-old girl, Charlie, is one of them. And then there's a lot of complicated things that happen on her journey to Sydney. And then we jump to 2019, and that same woman is obviously much older. She's living with her autistic grandson, and it's the beginning of COVID, or that happens very soon after. And all of the themes of free choice, feminism, and not just misogyny, but misogynists, female friendship, and family. It's one of the most impressive novels I've read in a long, long time. And I have a very special video that I hope will be coming your way soon. I'm not going to say any more about it because you know how much I like to surprise you. But this was a really surprising, unforgettable novel. If you don't mind reading it on ebook, start reading it immediately. It's a gorgeous softcover. If you're willing to pay as much for the shipping as for the book, which is what I did, I don't think you'll be sorry. I can see how long I've been talking, so I'm just going to hold this up and not really say very much more about it. Collected Works, my top read of the year by Lydia Sandgren, translated from the Swedish by Agnes Brume. I've mentioned it in several contexts during the course of these awards. I have a full review of it, but this one is one of the very best novels I've read. Not enough people have read it. It should have won the Man Booker Prize last year. It wasn't even nominated. It's an accessible but complex story about a mother who, quote-unquote, abandons her young family, baby who's just been weaned at the breast, and 3 or 4-year-old daughter, and her kind of screw-up of a husband. He's a writer wannabe, but he's getting in his own way, and they never hear from her again. After she leaves a mysterious note, and they never hear from her again. And then we get more of the backstory, a coming-of-age story about her husband, and another guy. Themes of not realizing your artistic dreams, not having the courage to explore your creativity, alongside narratives of the characters who did. All kinds of Swedish references, art, and literature that you're going to have a great time looking up if you're into that sort of thing. And a profound meditation on time and how we fill it and how we squander it. And when you find out what the title means, if you're anything like me, you need a box of Kleenex nearby. Oh my God, it has been a year, hasn't it? Thanks for watching.
Thank you.